At exactly 12:01 in the morning, the screen of my smartphone ignited like a distress flare against the dark shadows of my living room. My brother's voice was vibrating with a tremor so violent that I struggled to identify him at first. "What in God's name did you do, Sarah?" he whispered, his breath hitching in a way that signaled pure panic. "Dad just saw the local news report. He can't catch his breath and is already on the line with the paramedics." I stood perfectly still in the center of my apartment on the north side of Chicago, watching stray bits of New Year's Eve confetti drift past my window from the rooftop party above. The muffled echoes of Auld Sign and celebratory cheers were still vibrating through the vents and hallways of the building. On my television screen, a bright red breaking news banner was crawling steadily along the bottom of the high-definition display. There it was in bold, white lettering. My full name, Sarah Miller. I hadn't raised my voice to anyone in months, and I certainly hadn't made a scene, yet somehow, every debt and every silent sacrifice had finally come due at the turn of the calendar. By the time the professional firework displays started thundering over Lake Michigan, I was already sinking onto the hardwood floor. I leaned my back against the base of the fabric couch, wrapped tightly in a thick gray sweatshirt that still carried the faint, comforting scent of generic laundry soap and the crispness of the winter air outside. My apartment was clean in that hauntingly empty, untouched way that only truly lonely places are. There were no decorative party trays, no half-empty champagne bottles sweating condensation onto the granite counters, and no guest coats draped haphazardly over the dining chairs. It was just me, a muted television casting blue light over the room, and the soft, rhythmic hum of the heater clicking on and off as if it were struggling to process a difficult thought. Earlier that afternoon, I had stood in front of the hallway mirror for a long time, meticulously adjusting the collar of a simple navy blue wool sweater. It wasn't a formal uniform, nor was it my dress blues. It was just something normal, something a civilian daughter would wear to a family gathering. I remember the exact moment I paused, my hands freezing at my neck, because for a split second, I felt absolutely ridiculous for trying so hard. Hope is a dangerous thing in a family like mine. It sneaks up on you quietly and convinces you that this specific holiday might actually be different from the last 10. The text message from my father, Thomas, had arrived just after the noon hour. It was blunt and devoid of warmth. "Don't come out to Oak Creek tonight. This isn't a military base, and we're keeping the guest list relaxed." That was the entirety of the communication. There was no "I'm sorry for the short notice," or "maybe we can grab lunch next week." It was just that one single sentence, sharp and dismissive, as if he were swatting away a pesky fly that had dared to enter his personal space. I read the words 3 times, my thumb hovering indecisively over the digital keyboard. I thought about calling him to ask what he actually meant by relaxed, or reminding him that I had been deployed in the desert during 3 of the last 5 New Year's Eves. I wanted to tell him that I knew how to be quiet and how to avoid taking up too much space in a room, but in the end, I didn't send a word of protest. Somewhere deep in my gut, I knew exactly what he was saying without him having to spell it out. To him, everything I had become and every place I had been served as an inconvenience, a jagged disruption to the neat, predictable life he had planned for his children. So I simply typed back, "Okay, have a good night." It was just 5 words, neutral, professional, and detached. It was the same robotic tone I had mastered for after-action reports and uncomfortable debriefings with commanding officers. Say as little as possible and give them nothing to push back against. I spent the remainder of the day occupying myself with small, entirely unnecessary domestic tasks. I wiped down the kitchen counters twice until they gleamed. I refolded a stack of towels that were already perfectly aligned in the linen closet. I stood by the window for a long time, watching neighbors haul grocery bags filled with snacks and cases of local craft beer into nearby buildings, laughing and shouting greetings to one another across the icy street. Someone in the apartment down the hall was playing bass-heavy music too loud, the thumping rhythm vibrating through the walls like a second, unwanted heartbeat. I kept telling myself that I was perfectly fine, and that being alone was familiar territory for me. Still, when the winter sun finally dipped below the skyline, and the clouds turned that bruised shade of violet blue, something in my chest tightened painfully. New Year's Eve had always been the most important date on the calendar for my father. He was a man who believed fervently in clean slates and hard resets. He cherished the idea that if you toasted at the stroke of midnight with the right group of people, the next 12 months would somehow fall into a perfect line. It just seemed that those right people never quite included his eldest daughter. I eventually ordered some basic takeout from a Thai place on the corner of the block, a hole-in-the-wall spot with a faded, sun-bleached menu taped to the front window, and a delivery driver who never cracked a smile. The total came to $26.40, and the food sat growing cold on my coffee table while I sat on the sofa, mindlessly flipping through cable channels without actually registering a single image. Every major network was broadcasting the exact same spectacle: smiling hosts in sequins, glittering designer dresses, and massive crowds packed shoulder to shoulder as if the world wasn't currently full of deep fractures. At 10 minutes before the midnight countdown, I hit the mute button on the remote. The resulting silence was incredibly loud. It seemed to press in on me from all corners, filling the empty space where laughter and conversation should have been. It filled the gaps where my brother Jason's sarcastic remarks usually landed, and where my father's voice would always rise a few decibels too high after he finished his second stiff drink of the night. I found myself thinking about all the other holidays I had missed over the years. I remembered Thanksgivings spent eating dry, reheated turkey in a crowded mess hall halfway across the world. I remembered birthdays marked only by grainy, lagging video calls and empty promises to celebrate properly once I got back home. I had always told myself that this was simply the price of service, that sacrifice was a non-negotiable part of the deal I had signed. I believed it too, for a long time. What I hadn't expected, however, was to be punished for that service by the people who were supposed to be waiting for me. When the countdown finally began on the silent screen 10, 9, 8, I didn't join in. I just watched the white numbers flicker, my arms wrapped tightly around my knees. At the count of 0, my entire apartment building seemed to erupt. I could hear cheers through the ceiling, whistles from the street, and the muffled, rhythmic boom of fireworks cracking open the night sky over the city. I didn't move a muscle. The digital clock on my microwave flipped over to 12:01. That was the exact second my phone began to ring. I knew it was Jason before I even glanced at the caller ID. He never called me at this hour unless something had gone terribly wrong. His name flashed across the glowing screen, and for a fleeting second, I seriously considered letting it go straight to my voicemail. I was just so incredibly tired of being the responsible one, the steady one, the one who always picked up the phone to solve a crisis. I answered it anyway. Sarah. He said, using the childhood nickname I hadn't heard in years. His breathing was fast and uneven, bordering on a hyperventilation. What did you do? I'm just sitting at home, Jason, I said, my voice sounding hollow and confused. I didn't do anything. You had to have done something, he insisted, his voice rising in pitch. Dad just saw the local news segment. He went completely white. I mean ghost white. He started clutching at his chest and leaning on the TV stand. Is losing her mind and they're calling 911 right now. I stood up slowly from the floor, my bare feet feeling the bite of the cold wood. What news? What are you talking about? There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the chaotic sounds of people shouting in the background of my father's living room in Oak Creek. Someone had the television volume turned up to a deafening level. Your name, Sarah, Jason finally said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. They're putting your name on the TV. They're saying it like it actually matters to the whole country. My heart began to pound with a force that made each beat echo in my ears. I walked toward my television, my fingers shaking as I unmuted the sound. A bright red scroll was moving along the bottom of the screen under a breaking news header. And there it was, Miller, my last name, clear as a bell. For a long moment, I couldn't hear anything else. Jason was still talking, his words blurring into a frantic hum, but all I could focus on was that steady crawl of white letters moving across the glass, unstoppable and indifferent. I didn't mean for him to find out this way, I said quietly. The words meant more for myself than for my brother. What does that even mean? Jason demanded. What didn't you mean? I watched the screen, seeing my own faint reflection in the glass overlaying the news report. I looked much older than my years, grounded in a way that only comes from years of being trained to stand perfectly still under immense pressure. It means, I said, choosing my words with the precision of a surgeon, that tonight was never supposed to be about a New Year's party. He swore under his breath, a sound of pure frustration. You need to get in your car and get here right now, Sarah. I thought about the dismissive text message my father had sent me only 12 hours ago. I thought about the words, "This isn't a military base." I looked around my quiet, orderly, solitary apartment. No, I said, and for the first time in my life I truly meant it. I'm not coming. On the television, the news anchor continued to talk, contextualizing the report and laying out a series of facts that had been signed and sealed in government offices weeks ago. These were cold, hard facts that didn't care about hurt feelings, family traditions, or who had been uninvited to a holiday dinner. Jason went silent on the other end. Outside my window, another round of fireworks illuminated the Chicago sky. For the first time all night, I felt a strange sense of stability. It wasn't a feeling of triumph, and it certainly wasn't cruel, but I felt steady, like I had finally stopped bracing myself for an impact that had already occurred. Whatever was happening now had been set in motion long before the clock struck midnight. My brother stayed on the line, his breathing still heavy, as if he were afraid that if he hung up, his entire world would spontaneously combust. I set my phone on the counter on speakerphone and turned the television volume down just enough so I could monitor both the broadcast and my brother. The anchor's voice was polished and calm, the kind of professional tone that made even the most life-altering news sound like a reasonable weather report. Authorities in the capital confirmed just after the midnight transition, she stated, that a previously sealed federal administrative decision has officially gone into effect as of January 1st. Jason cursed again, softer this time. They're scrolling your name again, Sarah, he whispered. Dad just keeps staring at the screen asking what it means. He keeps yelling that this can't be right, that there's been some kind of mistake. I leaned my weight against the cool granite of the kitchen counter, closing my eyes to ground myself. I had known this specific moment would eventually arrive, but I hadn't expected it to show up dressed in holiday confetti and the sound of distant sirens. Is he okay? I asked, forcing my voice to remain level. He's sitting in his recliner now, Jason reported. But he isn't listening to a word or I say. He's just shouting at the TV screen like it's a person he can intimidate. That sounded exactly like the father I knew. Thomas Miller had always operated under the belief that if he simply spoke loudly enough and with enough conviction, the world would eventually correct itself to suit his preferences. On the screen, a detailed graphic appeared beside the news anchor, dates, legal documents, and a timeline laid out with clinical lack of emotion. This wasn't a rumor, and it wasn't a political opinion. It was a matter of procedure and federal policy, the kind of monumental shift that didn't bend just because a man in a suburb of Milwaukee felt uncomfortable. I found myself thinking back to the last time I had seen my father truly, viscerally angry. It had been nearly 3 years ago, when I told him I was extending my service contract for another term instead of moving back to our for good. He had slammed his hand onto the oak dining table so hard the silverware jumped, telling me that I was choosing that life over my own family. I had desperately wanted to tell him that that life was the only thing that had actually chosen me back, and that the uniform hadn't replaced my family. It had simply saved me when my family no longer knew what to do with a daughter who didn't fit their mold. But I had swallowed those words, just as I always did. Dad is saying you did this to embarrass him, Jason said suddenly, breaking my train of thought. He's telling everyone in the room that you made him look like a complete fool in front of the whole neighborhood. I let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. Jason, I wasn't even there. I was uninvited, remember? That's not how he's processing it, my brother replied. Is crying in the kitchen. People are starting to whisper and head for the door. One of the guys from the VFW post recognized your name and rank on the screen. I could easily picture the scene without even trying. I saw the living room packed with people holding red plastic cups, the TV blaring in the background, and my father standing way too close to the screen, as if physical proximity could change the truth of the report. I imagined the exact moment of recognition in the room, the sudden shift in energy, the hushed realizations, and the dawning fact that the daughter he had dismissed and told to stay away had somehow stepped into a national spotlight without ever raising her voice. "What exactly are they saying on your end?" Jason asked, his voice sounding small. "No one here will explain the specifics to me, they just keep saying it's official." "It is," I said. "It became federal law at the stroke of midnight." He went quiet for a long beat. I could practically hear his brain working, trying to fit this new information into the rigid version of the world he had inherited from our father. Jason had always lived much closer to our father's gravity than I had. He had absorbed all the unwritten rules without ever questioning them. He knew exactly when to push and exactly when to duck. This was entirely new territory for both of us. "You planned this, didn't you?" he asked finally. It wasn't an accusation, but rather a simple statement of fact. "I prepared," I corrected him. "There is a very significant difference between planning and preparing." The news anchor had moved on to the broader context of the decision, explaining how the administrative shift had been months in the making and had passed every necessary legal review. My name appeared on the screen again, this time paired with words like jurisdictional authority and oversight. These were the types of words my father usually respected, but only when they were attached to other men. "Dad keeps asking why you didn't tell him," Jason said. I thought about that for a second, about all the times I actually had told my father things that were deeply important. I had told him about my deployments, my minor injuries, and the career choices I was making for my own future. Almost every one of those conversations had ended with him shaking his head and telling me I was being difficult or stubborn, usually because my choices didn't align with his vision of a quiet life. "I didn't tell him because he would have tried to stop it," I said. "He would have tried to talk me out of it, or he would have found a way to take the credit for it once it worked." "That's not fair, Sarah," Jason muttered, though his heart wasn't in the defense. "Isn't it?" I asked gently. He didn't have an answer for me. The television cut to B-roll footage from earlier that evening in Times Square, crowds cheering, neon lights flashing, and a describing the new year as a rare chance for national renewal. The irony was almost too much to bear. Somewhere in my father's house, surrounded by noise and people, every single thing he believed to be solid was currently cracking wide open. And here I was, alone in my Chicago apartment, feeling strangely balanced for the first time in years. "Are you really not going to come here?" Jason asked again, his voice much quieter now. "They're asking for you." Even the paramedics asked where the daughter was. I imagined walking into that house in Oak Creek. I could see the way the conversations would stop the moment I hit the threshold. I could feel the way every eye in the room would follow me, measuring my movements and my expression. I could picture my father's impending anger, his hidden fear, and his desperate need to regain some semblance of control. I knew exactly how small I would feel standing in that doorway, regardless of my title or authority. "No," I said firmly. "Not tonight." There was another long pause. When Jason spoke again, his tone was different, heavier. "He told everyone tonight that you didn't come because you were too busy at the office. He said you couldn't find a way to unplug from work." I swallowed against a dry throat. "He told me not to come, Jason." "I know," my brother said softly. "I was standing right there when he sent the text." The news segment finally ended, replaced by a panel of talking heads who began speculating on the implications of the decision. People who had never met me were now debating my motives, praising my restraint, and questioning my background. I muted the TV again. I didn't need their commentary, the facts were more than enough to sustain me. "I have to go," Jason said suddenly. "The ambulance is here and they're bringing the gurney in." "Call me when you know more," I said. He hesitated before hanging up. "Sarah, whatever this is, it's much bigger than he ever thought you were." "I know," I replied. The line went dead with a soft click. I stood there for a long time in the silence, watching the quiet of the apartment settle back into its familiar place. Outside, The fireworks were finally beginning to slow down, the bursts becoming sporadic as people began to drift toward their beds. The new year had arrived whether anyone was truly ready for it or not. I thought about the stacks of paperwork I had signed months ago in those windowless rooms, the meetings that had taken place behind heavy, closed doors, and the careful consideration I had given to every possible consequence. None of it had been an impulsive act, and none of it had been intended as a personal attack. It had simply been necessary. On my coffee table, my phone began to buzz again with a barrage of incoming text messages, numbers I didn't recognize and names I hadn't thought of in a decade. I ignored them all. Tonight wasn't a night for explanations or apologies. I walked over to the window and watched the last of the gray smoke fade into the cold Illinois sky. Somewhere across the state line, my father was finally learning that the world didn't pause its rotation just because he disapproved of the direction. And for the very first time, that knowledge didn't frighten me at all. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the early hours of the morning lying on my couch with the lights off, just listening to the city of Chicago settle into the first quiet hours of the new year. A few sirens wailed somewhere in the distance toward the loop, then faded away. My heater continued its rhythmic clicking. My phone stayed face down on the table, vibrating every few minutes like a small, trapped animal trying to remind me of a reality I already understood. When the morning light finally arrived, it brought a thin gray glow and a heavy ache behind my eyes. I brewed a pot of coffee but didn't actually drink any of it. I just stood at the window and watched a city snowplow scrape the street clean, orange sparks flashing every time the metal blade caught the curb. It was the kind of practical, unglamorous work that had always felt the most honest to me. Clear the road and move forward. That had been my entire life's philosophy. Do the work, don't make a scene, and keep moving. Growing up, I had learned very early on how to make myself smaller. After my mother passed away when I was 12, our house in Oak Creek changed in ways that no one was allowed to talk about. My father filled the sudden void with a rigid structure of rules and expectations. He had incredibly sharp opinions about how things should be done, and more importantly, exactly who should be doing them. Jason fit into that structure with ease. He stayed close, he listened, and he learned which jokes would make Dad laugh and which topics were strictly off limits. I was the outlier. I asked questions that were deemed disrespectful. I pushed back against boundaries that felt arbitrary. I wanted to see what existed beyond the limits of our small town. When I first enlisted in the Army, my father told the neighbors I was just going through a phase. When I re-enlisted 4 years later, he stopped using my rank entirely when he introduced me to his friends, as if saying the words out loud might invite a disagreement he couldn't win. Don't bring that military stuff into this house. He would bark whenever I spoke too directly or tried to correct a factual error. This isn't a base. Over the years, that phrase had become his shorthand for everything he disliked about my adult life. My posture, my boundaries, and my refusal to soften my voice just to make the people around me feel more comfortable. Still, despite the friction, I had been the one to send money home when the property taxes on the house spiked by $3,200. I was the one who covered the $1,500 repair bill for his truck without being asked. I showed up whenever Jason needed a hand with his mortgage or whenever my father needed a significant favor. I did all of it quietly, without ever keeping a tally, because that was what I thought loyalty was supposed to look like. But I had eventually learned that in the Miller family, loyalty was strictly a one-way street. The decision that had changed everything tonight hadn't been born out of spite or anger. It had come from a place of pure, bone-deep exhaustion. Months ago, I had been sitting in a nondescript government conference room in D.C., the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, listening as a legal panel walked through a proposal that had been circulating for quite some time. It was a complex, multi-layered document that had been thoroughly vetted. My role in that room wasn't dramatic. I wasn't there to deliver a stirring speech. I was there because I possessed the specific authority, the years of field experience, and the legal standing to sign off on the final execution. I remember asking the hard questions. I remember reading every single line of the document twice. I thought about the people who would be affected by the change, not just as statistics on a page, but as real human beings. I only thought about my father in the abstract, as a representative of those who believed certain power structures were permanent simply because they had always existed. When I finally signed my name, I did it with the full knowledge of exactly when it would take effect. January 1st, at the stroke of midnight. It was a clean, sharp line between the before and the after. I hadn't told my family because, for the first time in my life, the decision wasn't theirs to influence or criticize. I didn't owe them a warning, and I certainly didn't owe them any reassurance. I owed myself a moment of absolute clarity. That following morning, while the various news networks were busy looping the most significant highlights from the previous night's events, my smartphone finally began to vibrate against the wood of my kitchen table once more. This time, the screen clearly displayed my father's name, and I sat there staring at it for a long, heavy moment before finally sliding the icon to answer. "What in the hell did you do, Sarah?" he demanded, immediately skipping over any pretense of a morning greeting. His voice was incredibly hoarse and sounded strained, as if he had been shouting or weeping for the last several hours straight. "I simply did my job, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice as calm and level as I possibly could. "You completely me," he snapped back, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface of his words. "You went out of your way to humiliate me in front of my friends. People have been calling the house all morning, asking me questions that I don't even have the answers to." I leaned my back against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes for a second. "You could have answered them very easily by just telling them the absolute truth." "And what truth would that be?" he shot back at me. "That my own daughter doesn't have enough respect for me to discuss her life before it becomes a headline on the morning news." I felt that familiar, nagging pull to apologize, the urge to smooth everything over and say whatever was necessary to ease his obvious discomfort. That reflex was incredibly strong after 28 years of constant practice. Instead, I stood my ground. "You were the one who told me not to come over last night, Dad." "That has absolutely nothing to do with this situation," he said quickly, dismissively. "It has everything to do with this," I replied. "You made it clear that you didn't want me there, and you didn't want what I represent in your house. However, you seemed perfectly fine with the idea of benefiting from my position whenever it suited your needs." A long, heavy silence stretched across the phone line between Chicago and Oak Creek. When he finally spoke again, his entire tone had shifted, sliding into that familiar, condescending defense he always used. "You're just reading way too much into things, Sarah." I almost smiled at that. It was his absolute favorite defense mechanism. He believed that if he minimized a problem long enough, it would eventually just stop existing. "I'm not reading into anything," I said. "I just finally stopped pretending that things were okay." He exhaled sharply into the receiver. "So, you think because you wear a uniform and you sign some government papers, you suddenly get to decide exactly how this family is supposed to operate?" "No," I said, my voice remaining steady. "I think that because I am an adult woman, I get to decide exactly how my own life is going to operate." He scoffed at that. "This isn't how a real family handles their disagreements, Sarah." I thought about all the countless times I had handled our disagreements by simply swallowing my own feelings. I thought of every holiday I had spent explaining my absence to various relatives who never bothered to ask why I was gone, only why I wasn't home to serve the dinner. I thought of every check I had written to cover his bills. Hopping those $1,500 payments would somehow buy me a little bit of genuine goodwill. "This wasn't a disagreement," I told him. "It was a boundary." There was another pause. I could hear his breathing through the phone. It was uneven, frustrated, and heavy. "You always do this," he muttered under his breath. "You always find a way to make things much harder than they actually need to be." "No," I said, my voice as steady as a rock. "I finally made them clear." He hung up the phone without saying another word to me. I set the device down on the counter and felt the full weight of the moment settle deep into my bones. It wasn't exactly relief, and it wasn't guilt, but rather a deep, unshakable sense of certainty. Outside my window, the street was clean now, the snow pushed into neat, manageable piles by the city plows. The year had officially begun, whether anyone liked it or not, and so had the consequences of every choice that had led us to this point. I didn't know how my brother or father would respond next, or how long the fallout of this decision would last, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity: I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply stopped asking for permission to exist. By the middle of the morning, the story had grown significant legs. I turned the television back on out of a sense of habit more than curiosity, and there was my name again. It was no longer just a passing mention in a scroll. It was now anchored to deep analysis, expert legal commentary, and constant headlines. The news anchor was speaking slowly and deliberately, as if she were aware that the information she was conveying would land hardest on the people who believed certain power structures were completely untouchable. This decision, the anchor explained, has been legally finalized for several months now. However, its official activation date of January 1st means that all of its effects are now immediate. Immediate, that one word echoed in my mind. I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee finally cooling in my hands, listening as the legal analysts broke down the implications in plain, simple language. There was no drama and no speculation, just cause and effect. They explained what had changed, who held the authority now, and who no longer did. My phone buzzed again with a text from Jason. "They're still talking about it on every channel," he wrote. "Dad keeps saying they must have the facts wrong." I typed back a simple response: "They don't." A full minute passed before the three typing dots appeared on my screen, then disappeared, and then appeared again. "People around town are asking if you planned this whole thing out," Jason sent. I looked around my apartment, at the framed commendations on the wall, the neatly stacked folders in my office corner, and the quiet, intentional order of a life I had built for myself. Planned, the word felt heavy, but it didn't carry the accusation Jason likely intended. "I prepared," I replied to him. "Planning implies a level of malice that just wasn't there." Another buzz followed. This time it was a call from a phone number I didn't recognize. I let it ring until it stopped. Then came another, and then a third. I finally turned the phone face down and focused my attention back on the TV screen. A graphic appeared that showed a timeline starting several years back, outlining every decision and approval that had led to this moment. Each one had been checked, double-checked, and by multiple offices. Somewhere in that timeline was my signature, one among many, but still perfectly visible and legally binding. I imagine my father watching this entire thing unfold in real time, surrounded by people who were now suddenly very quiet. Men he had shaken hands with for decades, neighbors who had complimented his yard, and church friends who thought they knew every detail of his family. All of them were learning at the same time that the daughter he had dismissed as a footnote was actually the hinge upon which the story turned. When my doorbell rang, I jumped despite my training. No one ever came to my door unannounced. I checked the peephole, half expecting to see a local reporter or an angry neighbor from the suburbs. Instead, it was just the delivery guy from the Thai place down the street, holding a brown paper bag. "I think this is yours," he said when I opened the door, pointing at the receipt. "You didn't even touch the bag I left last night." I gave him a faint smile and took the food from him. "Thanks," I said. "I appreciate it." As soon as the door clicked shut, the silence of the apartment rushed back in to greet me. I set the cold food on the counter and leaned against the edge of the granite, grounding myself once again. Even in a moment as monumental as this, I found that I still needed small, ordinary anchors to keep me from drifting. The TV cut to a split screen. On one side, there was footage of a formal press briefing. On the other, a still image of my father's neighborhood, a wide shot someone had pulled from public records. It wasn't an invasive photo, but it was enough to make the point that private lives do not stay private once they intersect with public consequences. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from my Aunt Carol. "Your father is absolutely beside himself, Sarah," she wrote. "Why on earth would you do something like this to him?" I stared at the glowing blue text for a long time before I bothered typing back. "I didn't do anything to him, Aunt Carol," I replied. "I did something for myself." The response was almost instantaneous. "Family doesn't work like that." I chose not to answer her. The news anchor's voice softened as she transitioned into a much broader discussion about how moments like this challenge long-held assumptions in American society. She spoke about how authority is often inherited without a single question until the day it suddenly isn't. She talked about generational shifts and the new era of accountability. I wondered if my father was actually hearing any of those words, or if he was simply stuck on the one detail his ego couldn't swallow: the fact that his control over me had finally reached its limit. Another call came in. This one I actually recognized. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed answer. "Are you happy now?" she asked, her voice sounding thin and stretched tight with raw emotion. I could hear muffled sounds in the background, voices moving around, and the general aftermath of a holiday party that had ended in a disaster. "I'm calm," I said. "There is a massive difference between being happy and being calm." She sniffed loudly. "He never saw this coming, Sarah, not in a million years." "I know," I replied. "He feels completely betrayed by his own flesh and blood," she added. I closed my eyes. "So did I said, "for a very long time." A long silence filled the space between us. Had always hovered on the very edge of our family dynamics, trying to smooth things over and avoid any direct conflict whenever possible. I didn't blame her for that behavior. In our house, that was the only way to survive. "People here are asking what this actually means for the future," she said finally. "They're asking if things are going to change." "They already have," I answered her. The call ended shortly after that, leaving everything unresolved. I didn't expect anything else. By the early afternoon, the story had mostly run its course on the 24-hour news cycle. News cycles move incredibly fast in this country. There was always something newer and louder waiting in the wings to take up the space. But the damage, or the correction, depending on which side of the line you stood on, had already been done. I turned the television off and stood in the absolute quiet of my kitchen, listening to the faint hum of my refrigerator and the distant, muffled sound of Chicago traffic. Outside, the world was getting on with its first day of the year. Inside, I felt something very important settle into its proper place. For years, my family had spoken about me only in terms of my absence, who I wasn't there to be, what I had missed, and how inconvenient my life choices were to them. Today, they were being forced to reckon with the person I actually was, not the edited version they had created for their own comfort, and not the daughter they only invited over when it suited their schedule. They were meeting the real me. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the dozens of missed calls and unread messages without actually opening any of them. There would be plenty of time for explanations later, or perhaps there wouldn't be. Either way, I felt no obligation to rush into the fire. I looked out my window at the pale, winter sky and felt an unfamiliar sensation rising in my chest. It wasn't pride, and it certainly wasn't a feeling of vengeance, but rather a profound sense of recognition. For the first time in my life, my name carried real weight in a room I wasn't even standing in, and no one could ever pretend again that I didn't belong. The call came just after the sun went down. I knew it was my father before I even checked the screen. It wasn't because I had his number saved, I hadn't saved it in months, but because of the physical weight that settled in my chest the moment the vibration started. Some instincts simply don't fade away, they just wait for the right moment to resurface. I let the phone ring 3 full times before I picked it up. "What did you honestly think would happen?" he said, skipping any form of hello. His voice was rough, sounding as if it had been scraped raw by a day full of anger and panic. "Did you think you could just do this and walk away from us?" "I didn't walk away, Dad," I replied evenly. "You were the one who told me not to come." "That is not the damn point," he snapped, his voice crackling with frustration. "You don't air our family business in public like this." I leaned my head back against the cushion of the couch and stared up at the ceiling. This was never family business. It was legal, professional business. You just happened to be someone who was affected by the outcome. A sharp, humorless laugh burst from him. "Don't you dare play word games with me, Sarah. You know exactly what this looks like to the world." "I know exactly what it is," I told him, "and those two things are not the same." He took a long, shaky breath. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted significantly, sliding into that familiar, reasonable, paternal voice he always used when he wanted my compliance. "You could have just talked to me first," he said softly. "We could have handled this quietly, like a real family should." I pictured every single time I had tried to do exactly that over the last decade. I remembered the conversations he had cut short, the concerns he had dismissed as dramatic, and all the moments when my presence had been tolerated but never truly welcomed. "I tried talking to you for years, Dad," I said. "You just never bothered to hear what I was saying." "That's not true," he insisted. "You always had a tendency to exaggerate things." I closed my eyes tight. "You told me that my life didn't belong in your house." He hesitated for just a split second. "I said this house wasn't a military base, Sarah. That's all I said." "But that is what I am," I replied. "You didn't want me there because you don't know how to sit in a room with that reality." His breath hitched, and then his voice turned sharp again. "You think wearing that uniform makes you better than the rest of us, don't you?" "No," I said quietly. "I think it finally taught me what a healthy boundary looks like." He went completely silent. When he eventually spoke again, the anger was back, raw, unfiltered, and shaking. "You embarrassed me in front of every single person I know. Do you have even the slightest idea what people are saying about me today?" "Yes," I answered. "They're finally saying the truth." "You think the truth matters more than your own family," he shot back at me. I paused for a moment. It wasn't because I didn't have an answer, but because I realized this was the question he had been asking me my entire life, whether he realized it or not. "I think a family that doesn't have respect isn't really a family at all," I said. "It's just an obligation." His voice rose in volume. "So that's it then. You just draw a line in the sand and decide that we're all on the wrong side of it." "I didn't decide that," I replied. "Your own actions over the years did." He scoffed. "You always were a difficult child." A small, bittersweet smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "You only ever said that when I stopped agreeing with everything you said." There was a dull thud on the other end of the line, sounding as if he had sat down hard in his chair. For a long moment, all I could hear was the sound of his heavy breathing. "You could fix this, Sarah," he said finally, his voice sounding small. "You could make this all go away if you wanted to." I straightened my posture. "How?" "You know how," he replied. "Just tell them it was all a big misunderstanding, walk the decision back, do something to fix it." I thought about the mountains of paperwork, the months of intense legal review, and the safeguards that had been built into the process specifically, so that no one could walk it back on a whim. I thought about the younger version of myself, standing in his kitchen in Oak Creek, and trying to explain why leaving for basic training felt so necessary. "I'm not fixing something that wasn't broken," I said. "And I am not undoing a massive professional decision just because it makes you feel uncomfortable." His voice cracked. "I am your father, Sarah." "Yes," I said. "And I am your daughter. I am not your asset, I am not your employee, and I am certainly not an extension of you." The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, pressing down on both of us across the miles. "I gave everything I had to this family," he said, his voice much quieter now. "So did I replied. "The only difference is that I don't expect total control in return for my loyalty." He swallowed audibly. "This isn't how I raised you to behave." I thought about my mother then, about her quiet strength, and the way she would always squeeze my hand whenever my father's temper started to flare up. I remembered the look she had given me on the day I left for training, a mixture of pride, fear, and deep understanding. "You raised me to stand on my own 2 feet, Dad," I said. "You just never thought I would eventually stand up to you." A sound escaped him then, something that sat somewhere between a heavy sigh and a groan of defeat. "You have no idea how hard this is for me." "I actually do," I said gently. "I just don't let your feelings decide everything in my life anymore." There was another pause, longer than all the others. "So, what happens now?" he asked, the fight finally draining out of his voice. "Now," I said, "we take some space from each other. We stop pretending that nothing happened. We eventually learn how to talk to one another without someone trying to win the conversation. And if I can't do that, he asked. Then we don't talk, I answered him. At least not until you can. The words hung between us, stark and completely unyielding. You would really do that to me, he murmured. I'm already doing it, I said. He didn't argue with me anymore. He didn't offer any more threats or guilt trips. He just let out a long, exhausted breath, the sound of a man finally realizing that he couldn't push me any harder than he already had. This isn't over, Sarah, he said weakly. No, I agreed, but it is certainly different now. When the call ended, I set the phone down carefully on the table, as if it were a piece of glass that might shatter. My hands were perfectly steady. My chest felt tight, but I didn't feel crushed. Outside, the night had deepened over Chicago, the city lights flickering on one by one like a sea of stars. I stood at the window and watched the world move through its routines, completely unaware of the quiet, monumental shift that had just taken place inside of me. For the first time in my life, I hadn't chosen peace at the expense of my own soul. I had finally chosen myself. The hospital in Oak Creek smelled like heavy antiseptic and burnt coffee, a combination that always made my shoulders tense up instinctively. I signed in at the front desk with the same calm efficiency I used in my professional life, even though my heart was beating way too fast and my palms felt uncomfortably dry. The nurse on duty glanced at my ID card, then up at me, and gave a small nod toward the east hallway. He's stable, she said. It was a panic-induced respiratory distress event. We've got him on supplemental oxygen right now, and the rest of the family is already inside. Family? The word landed much heavier than it should have in that sterile environment. I walked down the corridor slowly, listening to the rhythmic, soft beep of heart monitors behind the closed doors and the shuffle of rubber-soled shoes against the polished floors. This was a place designed for human vulnerability. There were no titles here and no authority, just bodies that required care. My brother was the very first person I saw when I stepped into the small room. Jason was standing by the window with his arms folded tight across his chest, staring out at the hospital parking lot as if he were looking for an exit strategy. He looked much smaller than I remembered him being, his shoulders rounded and his jaw clenched tight. Hey, I said quietly. He turned around, his eyes looking red-rimmed and exhausted. Hey, Sarah. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us making a move toward the other. The machines hummed steadily in the background. On the hospital bed, my father lay propped up on a stack of white pillows, a thin plastic tube running beneath his nose. His eyes were open but looked unfocused at first, then they sharpened as they finally landed on me. You actually came, he said, a note of disbelief threading through his raspy voice. I told you I would, I replied, once things settled down. Was sitting in a plastic chair in the corner, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming paper cup. She looked up at me, and her expression was completely unreadable, a mixture of fatigue, wariness, and relief all at once. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence in the room wasn't hostile, though, it was just incredibly careful. My father was the one who eventually broke it. You didn't have to come here, he said, his voice sounding rough. I know I didn't, I answered him, but I wanted to. He looked away from me, staring at the far wall as if the effort of meeting my eyes was simply too much for him to handle. The doctor said I'll be fine, he muttered under his breath. I just need to find a way to calm down. I nodded, that sounds exactly right. Jason let out a short, humorless breath from the window. The nurses told him he needs to stop watching the news for a while. That would definitely help, I said. For a moment, I honestly thought that might be the end of it, that we would all just circle around the obvious truth, avoid the real conversation, and eventually go our separate ways. That had always been our family pattern. But something in the atmosphere of the room felt different today. It was less charged and felt far less like a performance. My father shifted his weight uncomfortably on the thin mattress. They said on the TV that it was all completely legal, he said, still not looking directly at me. Everything you signed. Yes, I replied, it was. He swallowed hard. I didn't know you had that kind of power, Sarah. I know you didn't, I said. This time I didn't mean it as an accusation. Jason rubbed his hands together nervously. I didn't know either, he admitted, looking at the floor. I didn't know about any of it until last night. I turned to face him. That's because you never bothered to ask. He flinched at the words, then slowly nodded his head. That's fair, I guess I didn't. The heart monitor beeped steadily, sounding completely indifferent to our family reckoning. Stood up from her chair and moved closer to the bed, resting her hand lightly on my father's forearm. He didn't pull away from her touch this time. I think, she said softly, that we all probably made some very wrong assumptions about each other. My father let out a long, shaky breath. I thought I understood exactly how things worked in this world. I stepped a few inches closer to the bed, stopping at what I felt was a respectful distance. You only understood how they worked as long as I stayed quiet and did what I was told. He winced at that. Do you honestly think I ever wanted to hurt you, Sarah? I considered his question with extreme care before answering. No, I said. I think you just didn't think about me as a person at all. That sentence seemed to land harder on him than any amount of anger ever could have. His mouth opened to respond, then closed again. His eyes began to shine with moisture, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't tell if it was from fear or genuine regret. I just didn't know how to relate to you anymore, he admitted in a whisper. After you left for the service, after everything about you changed. I didn't stop being your daughter, Dad, I replied. I just became someone that you couldn't control anymore. Jason exhaled slowly, the sound echoing in the small room. Dad, he said, you promised me things. You told me that everything was going to work out for me because of the family name. My father turned his head toward my brother. I was only trying to help you, Jason. You were trying to protect me from reality, Jason corrected him. There is a massive difference. His hand tightened slightly on my father's arm. We all leaned on you, Sarah, she said, looking directly at me. We probably leaned on you much more than we ever should have. I met her gaze and held it. I let you do it, I said. That was the absolute truth of the matter. Accountability didn't just move in one direction, I had played my part in the dynamic too. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt like a necessary pause rather than an avoidance. My father shifted in the bed, wincing slightly as he moved. I can't undo what's already been done, he said. I can see that clearly now. I'm not asking you to undo anything, I replied. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if he were finally seeing the lines that time, stress, and experience had carved into my face over the years. What is it that you actually want from us, Sarah? The question took me by surprise. It wasn't because I didn't have an answer ready, but because he had never once bothered to ask me that question in my entire life. I want honesty, I said firmly. I want genuine respect, and I want you to stop speaking about me as if I'm a problem that needs to be managed. He nodded his head very slowly. I don't know if I'll be able to get it right every time. I don't need you to be perfect, I replied. I just need you to put in the effort. Jason stepped closer to the foot of the bed, his voice sounding low. And what about me, Sarah? What do you want from me? I turned to look at my brother. I want you to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet, Jason. I will always support you, but I am officially done carrying you. He swallowed hard, then gave a single, firm nod. I think I can try to do that. That was enough for right now. A few moments later, a nurse appeared at the door with a clipboard in her hand. I'm going to have to ask everyone to step out into the hallway for a little bit, she said gently. The patient needs to get some rest. We all without any argument. In the hallway, Jason leaned his back against the sterile wall and dragged a hand down his tired face. I didn't realize until last night just how much I had come to depend on you for everything, he said quietly. I didn't realize until last night just how much that dependency was costing me, I replied. He gave me a small, sad smile. I guess we're both doing some learning today. Lingered near the door of the hospital room. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," she said. "Thank you for not making things even worse than they were." I thought about that for a second, about all the different ways this situation could have spiraled out of control. "I didn't come here to win a fight," I said. "I just came here so that I could finally be seen for who I am." As I stepped out into the hospital parking lot, the cold winter air bit sharply at my cheeks. The sky was perfectly clear, and the stars looked like jagged shards of glass against the dark expanse. I stood by my car for a moment, breathing deeply and feeling the long-held tension in my body finally begin to loosen. The consequences of my decision were still actively unfolding, and nothing had been neatly or perfectly resolved, but something vital had shifted in the foundation of my life. For the very first time, my family was reacting to the real me, not the fictional version they had created for their own convenience. And that, I realized with a sudden clarity, was its own kind of beginning. Spring arrived in Chicago very quietly, which is how real, lasting change usually happens. It didn't come with loud announcements or dramatic apologies shouted across a crowded room, but rather with small, ordinary adjustments that only became obvious when I stopped to look back at how far we had come. The thick piles of gray snow eventually melted into narrow rivers along the city sidewalks. Small green buds began to appear on the trees I had never really noticed before. The city shook off the weight of winter and kept moving forward, completely indifferent to my family's personal reckoning. And I kept moving, too. The weeks following that hospital visit in Oak Creek were very careful ones for all of us. My father didn't call me every single day. When he did reach out, he spoke much slower, as if he were carefully measuring the weight of each word before he let it go into the world. Sometimes our phone calls were incredibly awkward, filled with long, uncomfortable pauses and meaningless updates about the local weather. But sometimes the calls were actually better, real conversations that didn't feel like interrogations or lectures. We were slowly learning a brand new language with one another, one that didn't rely on the old tools of guilt or unearned authority. Jason changed, too. It didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't a dramatic transformation, but he started asking me questions about my life instead of just waiting for me to give him instructions. He started talking about finding a new line of work that didn't depend on someone else smoothing the path for him. He failed at a few things early on, and to both of our credit, he didn't immediately call me to fix the mess. That part of the process was incredibly hard for both of us to navigate. Real growth usually is. As for me, I finally stopped bracing myself for the next blow. I hadn't realized exactly how much of my mental energy I had spent anticipating conflict until there was suddenly no conflict to anticipate. My shoulders finally relaxed. I began to sleep through the entire night without waking up once. I started doing small things just because I genuinely wanted to do them. I took long, aimless walks along the lakefront after work. I spent time cooking elaborate meals that took hours to prepare. I even started leaving my smartphone in another room for hours at a time, without feeling a shred of anxiety about what I might be missing. One afternoon, several months into the new year, my father called and asked if he could drive into the city to see me. "Just to talk for a bit," he said over the phone, his voice sounding tentative. "If that's okay with you, of course." I took a moment to think about it, really think about it, instead of just giving him an automatic yes to keep the peace. Then I told him he could come. He arrived at my apartment without any of his usual ceremony. His hands were empty, and his posture looked uncharacteristically uncertain. We sat together at my small kitchen table while the afternoon sunlight streamed in through the window. He looked around the room, taking in every detail of my life and the quiet, intentional order of the space. "You've built a very good life for yourself here, Sarah," he said finally. I nodded. I did. He cleared his throat, looking down at his hands. "I know I didn't always make it easy for you to do that." "No," I agreed with him. "You certainly didn't." He didn't try to argue with me or minimize my experience. That one small act of silence felt like more progress than we had made in 20 years. We spent the afternoon talking about my mother, sharing stories that hadn't been told in a very long time. We talked about the past, without trying to rewrite the history or pretending that it hadn't caused a lot of pain. When he finally left to drive back to Oak Creek, there were no dramatic resolutions or promises carved in stone, but there was a quiet understanding that things would be different from now on because they simply had to be. That night, I stood by my window again, watching the city lights of Chicago flicker on as the evening settled over the skyline. It wasn't a holiday, and there were no fireworks or countdowns to mark the moment. It was just another ordinary Tuesday night. And yet, it felt much more like a real beginning than that New Year's Eve ever had. I thought back to the moment my father had sent that text telling me not to come over. This isn't a military base. At the time, those words had felt like a sharp rejection. Now, they felt like a historic marker, the very last time I had ever allowed someone else to define where I belonged. Belonging, I had finally learned, isn't about waiting for an invitation to the table. It's about being respected once you choose to arrive. If you are listening to this story right now, and something in it feels familiar to your own life, I want you to listen closely. If you have ever been told to make yourself smaller just to ensure the comfort of the people around you, or if you have ever been praised for your strength while simultaneously being punished for actually using it, please know this. You are allowed to draw a line in the sand. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to choose your own peace, even when it inevitably disappoints the people who have spent years benefiting from your silence. Setting a boundary doesn't make you a cold or uncaring person, it simply makes you an honest one. And honesty, even when it is incredibly uncomfortable, is the only foundation that a real connection can ever be built upon. If this story resonated with you today, I would truly love to hear your personal thoughts. Please leave a comment below and let me know where you are listening from. We are sharing stories of resilience, boundaries, and finding your footing every single day. Consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep this journey going together.